held in Rio de Janeiro.
Economics Forum in Rio de Janeiro. My name is Moises Naim. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. What we are going to do this afternoon is a multifold exercise that I think is going to be fascinating and is going to set the stage for the continuation of the conversations that were started here in the last 2 days. As you know, the hallmark of a good meeting and of a good conversation is that it lingers and it continues after the meeting ends. And so the purpose is that all of you go back thinking about some of the conversations, ideas, and insights that you gained in these last 2 days. To help us in that task and to start a conversation that will, as quickly as possible, introduce you and include you all, we have a wonderful panel with us. Let me start to my right and your left with Ricardo Villela Marino. He's the Chief Executive Officer Latin America of Banco, Itaú, Unibanco from Brazil. That bank is the largest bank in the Southern Hemisphere and is the 10th largest bank in the world. He's also a young global leader. Welcome and thank you. Aécio Neves da Cunha is the governor of Minas Gerais. Welcome, Mr. Governor. Minas Gerais is the second largest state in Brazil. That means that Minas Gerais is larger than most countries in the neighborhood and in the region, perhaps indeed in the world. Also, Minas Gerais is a pioneer in transferring efficiency technologies and productivity technology in the management of the public sector. And the governor was a leader in that process. Glad to have you with us. Marcelo Bahia Odebrecht is the CEO of Engineering and Construction Division of Odebrecht Brazil and president of the Odebrecht Group in Brazil. He's the co-chairman of this meeting. Odebrecht, as you all know, is one of the largest construction engineering companies in the world. It's also a diversified conglomerate operating in several sectors. Welcome and thank you. Luis Guillermo Plata is the very well-known Minister of Trade, Industry and Tourism in Colombia. During his tenure as minister, Colombia has achieved surprising and very welcome developments in its economy. Colombia is now a location that foreign investors are looking at, and indeed he can also give us some numbers that show how impressive has been the growth of foreign investment and in general investment and trade in Colombia. Welcome, Minister Plata. He's also a young global leader for tomorrow. Part of the exercise was to collect some of your thoughts, ideas, and insights and putting them into a document that I think has been distributed, that brings together and pulls together some or many of the main themes that were discussed by all of us in these sessions in the last 2 days. We have delivered those conclusions and that statement of that meeting to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, José Miguel Insulza, who cannot be with us because he is in Trinidad as one of the hosts and organizers and leaders of the Summit of the Americas. But Secretary General Insulza is going to join us now via video conference. I don't know if he's already on. We can connect with Secretary General Insulza. We hope. Hi.
Hello.
Hola, José Miguel.
Hello. Moisés.
José Miguel, hi. ¿Cómo estás?
¿Qué tal? ¿Qué tal? Hello.
Welcome and thank you very much for making the time in the middle of the Summit of the Americas to be with us. You have received...
Thank you very much. I have received the information and I'm looking forward to hearing the comments of the panel. And of course I will be really pleased to transfer this information that you're sending me to the heads of state and government in the next few days.
Thank you very much, José Miguel. I don't know if you care to share with us some of your ideas and expectations about the Summit of the Americas?
Well, of course, it's not easy to sum up everything we expect, especially because the summit begins tomorrow, and today we are just finishing the preliminary meeting. There's a meeting, as you know, the private sector also. There is a meeting of civil society, a young leaders meeting, and the meeting of members of parliament. So, in general, I would say that there's a great expectation of three things. One, of course, is the issues that originally formed the agenda of the summit, and they had to do mainly with issues like human prosperity, mainly poverty and inequality, and of course economic growth and other issues in that area. Then there was global warming and also issues of energy. But after the crisis, the agenda changed, of course, and we expect a very large discussion among the heads of state and government on the economic crisis. In light of the G20 meeting, we think that there should be a discussion on the ways the conclusions of the G20 apply to the conclusions, by the way, in which 5 members of the G20 are members also of this Summit of the Americas: the U.S., Canada, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. And we expect from the conclusions of the G20 to have also some conclusions that will be helpful to the hemisphere, especially to the countries that are in more need of financial flows to solve the crisis. And then there's also, of course, the Obama factor, the fact that President Obama will be present for the first time in a meeting of the Americas, only 90 days after being inaugurated. And of course, that's a natural expectation from all presidents and heads of government for this meeting with President Obama, especially when he said that he wanted very much to do policy with us and not policy for us. So we want to see how that develops during the summer.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. And you know, because you are at the center of the Inter-American system, that Latin America comes to this meeting with some significant divisions between countries in terms of their attitude towards private investors, their attitude towards the United States, globalization, trade, and so on. There are different postures that are well known among different groups. Do you think that division will affect the deliberations, and do you expect a very complicated negotiation of the final resolution?
Well, I sincerely hope not. I've heard that some countries are reviewing their position towards the resolution, basically because they think that it doesn't take adequately into account the problems of the crisis. Of course, which it couldn't happen because the resolution has been negotiated for the last 6 months, and the G20 took place only 2 weeks ago. But and basically because they think that the hemisphere is changing in a way that the other members don't share that much the view of those changes. But I expect that all those things will give for a lively discussion, but that eventually or finally the desire for unity will prevail, and that we will recognize that we have a lot of identities in matters of democracy, in matters of economic behavior, in matters of concerns about the crisis, in matters of concerns about poverty, inequality, in matters of the well-functioning of our economic systems in the past 7 years, etc. We have a lot of things that have happened in the region. We have a lot of common goals, and we expect those to prevail. So I think that to sum up, I hope we have a lively discussion. I expect a lot of some differences to appear, but I hope that we will have a reasonably good conclusion.
Thank you very much, and we all here wish you good luck, and we need you to be lucky and have a very successful summit, and hopefully from that summit will come things that will develop and shape the relationship inside the region and from the region with the rest of the world. So, Secretary General, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to send a really nice abrazo to our friends from the from the Davos and the World Economic Forum. You know, I'm an old member of the World Economic Forum. The last time I checked, I have been to about 30 meetings of the West, and I'm very sorry not be able to be there. But I send you all the best, and thank you for your work, and thank you for the conclusions that you have arrived to.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, and again, good luck, and thank you for being with us. So let's start with our own conversation here, and perhaps I would like to start with the governor. This crisis, this economic crisis, as I have said before, and I think there is great agreement, it's not going to be solved without an active and efficient public sector. We need to restore confidence and the strength of the private sector, but the public sector needs to come up with innovation and ideas and leadership. And you have been a leader in trying to strengthen and make the private sector in your state more efficient. So perhaps you can share with us.
First, I'd like to say thank you very much for the invitation. Very important to stay here. And I'd like to ask for your license to say some words in my language, in Portuguese.
In fact, when you participate in a forum like this one, at the closing session especially, one runs the risk of being repetitive. So I would like to ask you, please not to take any notice of that and help me if needs be. So I'd like to say the first thing which is in my mind, something which I think has been a consensus, differently from that was diagnosed initially. And that is that we are not dealing with a financial crisis anymore, but rather a crisis that affects all the markets, a clearly global crisis. It started as a financial crisis, it became an economic crisis, and even more seriously has become a social crisis of very, very in-depth proportions. Obviously, it has an ethical component as well, and a lack of trust among market negotiations in the government and the private sector, which must be clearly understood. So these relations can reach a new level of understanding. Moisés has asked me to say whether overcoming this crisis, whether this depends on a joint effort, both domestic, in our case of Brazil or Latin America, and with other regions of the world. And it also depends on a new relationship between the public and private. We have had a growth in Latin America in the last 2 or 3 years of approximately 4.2%, but we have not reduced the distortions, which are still very serious. We have almost 600 million inhabitants. Almost 40% of this population still lives below the line of poverty. And we, unfortunately, as I see it, have not made the best of the economic expansion times of the years pre-crisis to make deep adjustments in the public sector, which needed to be done. This is a domestic problem in Brazil, but it also occurs in other countries of Latin America. And this perhaps is the contribution that Minas Gerais here so politely stated by the mediator is an innovative state in public management, and has tried to show that the organized state, the state with new evaluation parameters, the state which establishes very clear targets to be achieved and which overcomes that maxim which many of us passively agree, that the state is inefficient by nature. I think not. I think the state can be the largest and the strongest partner of the private sector in overcoming the crisis. We have not been able to expand economically as we should have done before, and this is a gap left in Brazil and in other countries as well. and carry out the structural reforms to give the state more agility and introduce new mechanisms to encourage investments, such as, for example, the public-private partnerships. It is incredible that a country as large as Brazil does not have today consolidated any public-private partnership, which is truly significant. I would dare to say, and the example in Minas, we have in the road and prison systems very important investments carried out along this line. And today, on the different states, here we have with us Governor Braga, who is an example of the new generation, a very clear movement, which has not yet picked up adequate speed by the central government, but it is exactly along these lines to establish new mechanisms and professionalize the public sector so the state can be not a burden at this particular moment when the crisis deepens. So this problem exists in Brazil and in other countries, and there has been growing concentration of taxes in the hands of the federal government. We are a federation, but in fact, I would like to give an example, a very clear example, which shows the direction we're taking in Brazil, which must be interrupted. In 1988, I was a deputy, elected deputy. At that time, the contributions, what we call contributions, in fact, are taxes appropriated by the federal government without any sharing with states and municipalities. In 88, therefore 20 years ago, these so-called contributions were appropriated by the federal government, and they accounted for 10% of everything which was taken in the country, with income tax and a tax on industrialized products, making up a basket to be shared among states and municipality. 10% 20 years ago. Today, the contributions, and forgive me to be redundant, accumulated by the union account for more than 120% of everything which is collected in income tax and the IPI. And so we can see clearly the consequences of this. We are at a very difficult time of the crisis. The municipalities, who could be important partners with new investments and new partnerships, become a burden besides the one which we already had. So I do not wish to say too much at the moment, but I think at a moment of a crisis like this, it is necessary that we get away from immediate demands and take a very much clearer X-ray of our political structure and new pathways to follow. And regarding Brazil and other countries in Latin America, it is very important to refound, the federation, share resources better, decentralize responsibilities. We do not have in the modern world, no country the size of Brazil, or even smaller countries than Brazil, a strange figure of the so-called federal highways. And this to me is a very clear example that this will only have as a consequence inefficiency, lack of transparency, difficulty to build public-private partnerships. Therefore, this is the moment to modernize the state and rebuild our federation, establishing the stronger presence of states and municipalities so that they can be true partners in solving the crisis. Thank you.
Gobernador. Ricardo Villela Marino, share with us some of your conclusions and some of the takeaways from your 2 days in these meetings.
With pleasure, Moises. Thanks for the opportunity. On the last few days, I took some notes on some of the panels that we discussed here in different areas, different segments, very interesting panels. And I just heard from Mr. Insulza in the Summits of the Americas, where the team that is going to discuss and debate President Obama and others is regarding the new sustainable development cycle. And I think that most of the indispensable conditions for us to reach this new sustainable development cycle is already available in the majority of the Latin American countries. You know, I have to name 6 that I took some notes, only 6, but there are others just to focus, and it's quite very related to the declaration for the summit that the World Economic Forum just distributed, will be the following. I think number one, we all agree that a financial and banking system that one hand, we agree that still has a lot of room for improvement, but on the other hand, it's already sound, healthy, and performing normally. Number two, I think that abundance of natural resources, here we have governor of Amazon with us, in terms of food production, for example, ample energy sources and mineral reserves. It's a privilege to have this type of resources in a world in demographic expansion and hungry for food and energy. Number three, I would say that a high reliance on clean and renewable energy. The Brazil, for example, and Marcelo has talked about this, Brazil has an energy matrix, for instance, that's overwhelmingly dependent on hydroelectricity, which is a clean and renewable source in a very significant proportion. Actually, more than double what Europe has a target to reach, and it will only reach a couple decades from now. And moreover, I think Brazil is the only nation in the world that has enjoyed a 30-year successful experience with effective biofuel alternative. Minister Furlan also talks a lot about this competitive advantage, and the sugarcane ethanol is one of the examples. And we have other potential for expanding in other biomass alternatives. At the same time, at other countries in Latin America with similar conditions could do. Number four, I think that extremely favorable balance between rich natural resources and population. In contrast, for example, with Africa and Southern Asia, the phase of high social pressure arising from too fast demographic rates and expansion in urbanization, growth is already over in Latin America, which provides governments with the opportunity for focusing in improving not only the quality, but especially not only the quantity. We have a lot of quantity, but the quality of health, the quality of education and sanitation, not to mention investment in human capital. Number five, I'll mention that the majority of Latin America has consolidated a democratic institution and is not involved in deep and violent racial, religious, or cultural conflicts. Neither is subject to dangers of instability regarding common areas of chronic violence or even terrorism. And six, but not least important, I'll mention the macroeconomic fundamentals that have resisted fairly well the impact of the current crisis and remain solid. For example, inflation and budget deficits are relatively low, international reserves are high, foreign trade has found new markets in China and Asia, for example. Foreign indebtedness is low or in some countries even non-existent. Central banks and Ministry of Finance have quite some space in order to use monetary policy, i.e. meaning reduction of interest rates, and in some cases, spaces for fiscal stimulus as well. So having said that, I would like to mention that, in my view, the overwhelming conclusion that stands out on those 2 days of intense debate is that Latin American participants, in general, from what I heard those 2 days, they feel that they are able to face this crisis in a better condition than in any time in the past. And this is not a matter of sheer luck, because if you look, it was a result of a hard-won macroeconomic conquests. I think that besides much of the improvement in those economic fundamentals, there are very concrete changes for the best that explain, in my view, why the prevailing mood among the participants here in the Rio World Economic Forum is much more hopeful and encouraging than the mood that I felt last winter in Davos, hearing North Americans and European speakers. The most difference between our situation and theirs is that, of course, the state of the banking and the financial system, and much of the pessimism and fear still widespread in the worst affected economies stem from the continuous concern and uncertainty regarding the current efforts to rebuild a healthy and working banking system. It is impossible to exaggerate the decisive importance of this contrast. The indispensable fact that banks are largely intact in Latin America have performing normally under this threat in turbulent times, we can see that it's not casual, it's not accidental. Actually, a little over a decade ago, Latin America would have been devastated even by lesser crises than in the current one. Since then, we went through painful, profound reforms. We carry out those reforms to strengthen the financial system. And many banks in the region that have been able to hide their fundamental flaws behind high levels of inflation had to be rescued or even liquidated once inflation was defeated. As a result, a much sounder system emerged through the adoption of improved regulation and supervision that proved the resilience during the current global turbulence. I think there are another outstanding change that we can notice, this time in relation to our own past, is that enhanced social and environmental responsibility in part of government, private sector, and public opinion in general. We have been noticed this in most of the panels that we heard. And there is a sense that the crisis provides us with an opportunity for making education, a panel just finished, education and values, an investment in human resources development, two of the priorities when overcoming the downturn. And after having successfully and restored the modicum economic fundamentals, Latin America has now to face a different debt. It has to face its social debt. And this is key because every individual must be empowered to education and equal opportunities to become an active member of the market economy, either as a producer or as a consumer. This is not only a prerequisite for real citizenship. I think it's an indispensable precondition, as well as preserving domestic demand, enough preserved in order to make up for the loss of dynamism in the global economy. I think now two factors that are really new for the World Economic Forum and are being perceived and it must be implemented is regarding the crisis and then being taught and discussed that the market should take the guidance of ethics and morality. Those two and other values should be our moral compass to regard not what we do, but how we do it. It's very important to be guided by those ethical and character pillars. And this has two indispensable, inescapable consequences. First, I think that sound economies require definitely social justice, human capital enhancement, and effective commitment to solidarity. And why not social cohesion? And secondly, I will say that improvement in social and human conditions have to go hand in hand in cooperation, as was mentioned here, with an enlightened effort to promote environmentally sustainable policies. Sustainability is a key word from now on. We cannot escape from that. And not only in the moral imperative of survival, as an equally opportunity for a powerful source of new technology to rescue the economy from this recession that we are living. For all these concrete differences, I think it's reasonable to expect that Latin America will prove capable of weathering the economic storm somewhat better than in the past, and somewhat better than other advanced countries. Just to give you some historical perspective, in the late Depression, at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 1930s, most Latin American countries were able and show capacity to rebound and go back to the pre-1929 levels of production before the US and before Europe. Actually, Colombia went back in 1932, Brazil in 1933, and Mexico in 1934. So I think that the most relevant conclusion to be drawn from those 2 days of thoughtful and balanced debates here in Rio de Janeiro is that Latin America participants, by and far, share the conviction that we enjoy the necessary conditions to at least repeat the past performance, and why not do relatively better than in the past this time.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for a comprehensive and very interesting summary of your takeaways from the meetings. Marcelo, please.
Good afternoon. I grab the opportunity that the governor is here to ask permission to speak my mother tongue. Ao longo desses 2 dias aí, a gente teve...
Throughout these 2 days, we have had the chance of discussing some themes, and I will quickly list them, at least the panels that I was present at, and also the conversations that we had in the corridors. First of all, it became very clear to us all the need for re-establishing trust in the system, and with this the question of credit. We have, at least in Latin America, not a demand crisis, but rather a crisis of credit. I think that demand we can still generate. Therefore, at the end, what we are suffering from is the symptoms of the crisis from credit. So I think it's very important to establish trust and credit. Therefore, and another question that was mentioned, and the governor mentioned, although he was not here the last couple of days, is the issue of a need for public-private partnership, ever stronger, not only from the economic point of view, but above all in reducing poverty and improving the distribution of wealth. We had a panel today where this was discussed at length, and where really the government and the private initiative can work together. And also at this particular time when everybody thinks, with the downturn of the economy, many people don't want to invest money in social projects, but quite the contrary. This is when it should be done. And finally, there was an important discussion on the panel about energy. And it became very clear that there is need, in my opinion, of discussing things. I think we have to get away with this, the government and society and environmentals all discussing things and not really wanting to say anything. We must all sit down together, and all of us certainly have the same interests. I think corporations in all the different sectors, generation, oil, whatever, after all, any industry that you go to will have some company which is interested in this. So it's no use saying that, energy has to be used by all. So this is the main issue. What is the best way of generating energy from the environmental point of view and economic point of view? Therefore, I think that this is a very important question, and we cannot get away from it. I'm quite sure that if we sit down and discuss all the dimensions involved, we certainly will be able to draw up a model. And finally, I also want to make it very clear what I understood regarding the perception of this forum in general. I think we can take this forum as being a great opportunity. I think perhaps in many countries, Brazil, but many other countries of Latin America, we can perhaps see in 2 years' time and say the best thing that has happened was the crisis. I think that we were growing in rather a disorganized way. I think that we were growing in a way that was not sustainable over the long term. And so I think that now in this crisis we have the many opportunities, a geopolitical opportunity, to leave behind all those differences which we had among companies, countries, and regional leaders, and look ahead, inaugurate a new era of integration and of strengthening trust. I think this is a unique opportunity, and this opportunity starts tomorrow. I think Minister Patruski asked a question at today's panel, which I think was so important, and I think the forum answered this. The poor people may be the solution to the problem. In the same way that we can say today that Latin America can help to be the solution to get out of the crisis, perhaps for the first time, to help poor people will help us exit the crisis. To help poor people, not only because we have a social debt to pay them. In Latin America, we have a tremendous debt for the less privileged brackets of the population, but it is perhaps in the poor where we can generate the opportunities that Latin America has today to generate necessary demand to get out of this crisis. So we must invest in popular housing, or the people's housing, and just imagine this population consuming twice as much, because Americans and Europeans will not consume twice as much as what they are consuming today. But if Latin Americans begin to consume twice as many calories as they do today, this is going to make a huge difference from the point of view of generating demand. And finally, I think, coming back to emphasize a question that was mentioned before as well, the governor mentioned too, this is the moment to do things that we have always wanted to do. For years, we have been trying to do. The governments have been trying to do. And for the first time now we have this much greater awareness. We cannot lose this opportunity to look in within our companies, for the government to look in upon itself and do all that which we've always wanted to do. So I am leaving this forum in a very optimistic mood, not only from the point of view that it's like Ricardo said, Davos, the mood at Davos maybe was different, but I think that I am very optimistic. Looking ahead, I think we will find in the crisis great opportunity to put our house in order. And we will remember this moment favorably.
Hear optimistic perspective. So thank you very much for both a set of ideas that is very optimistic, but also has a very strong dose of realism. So that's a very, very good way of summarizing your views. Luis Guillermo Plata.
Thank you, Moisés. Thank you so much. Voy a hablar en español, ya que todos.
I will speak in Spanish, as all of us have spoken in our mother tongue, except for the moderator. Therefore, I would like to go to back to speaking Spanish. It is very interesting to come to the forum as a participant to represent the president, as I did not have the opportunity to be here as other participants. I have only been at one or two panels, and I would like to summarize what was mentioned at these panels. We spoke about the regional integration, which is a very important issue that has been debated for decades. And we have come very close to this integration, but we are also far from having a full integration. We have continental initiatives such as the Latin American Free Trade Zone, ALADI, Mercosur, and others. But at the end of the day, we are still quite far from this integration. We are not very close to having something similar to the European integration, despite the fact that we began this process almost simultaneously. We are aware that integration is important because as integration comes about, we have a growth in the market, in trade, and in consumption. Recently, this integration has taken on a completely different form. It began to exist as we created bilateral trade agreements among neighboring countries. For the case of Colombia, we have a bilateral agreement with Lacan, with Mexico. We have another free trade area with Mexico, with Chile. one with Mercosur. And if we begin to look at each of these countries, we see that there is a network of trade agreements. So we ask ourselves, if we were all able to come to these trade agreements, what is missing to take the next step? Because the free trade area for the Americas, which was a dream of having a free trade area from the Patagonia to Alaska, what is it that is missing? And we see that it is coming about, but in a completely different fashion, not based on design, but based on default. And this is due to the fact that we have begun making these treaties. And what is it that we have to do to have a true free trade area? We have micro problems and macro problems. For example, how to create the rules of origin, to have common rules, and that will enable us to move our merchandise. How can we have more homogeneous custom procedures? If we have common procedures, we will be ever more effective, and we will be able to have the free movement of merchandise throughout the continent. Sanitary and phytosanitary issues, because there are restrictions that are issued every day. And once again, we need to have the appropriate standards and specifications so that these issues will no longer be an obstacle to integration and will become something that will help integration. The integration could be a response to the crisis, but this will take time. There are some initiatives underway, for example, the ARCO initiative. Therefore, the issue is how to formalize all of this. And protectionism, of course, is not the solution. It is something that is very tempting. President Lula made reference to this yesterday, but it is not a solution, because if we begin to issue protectionist measures, we will reduce the movements of the market. It may render immediate results. It may alleviate the pain of an industry momentarily. But if this becomes a process, and generally these protectionist processes are for retaliation, what will happen is that we will have a shrinkage in our market, and this will not be helpful. There are important expectations with the World Trade Organization, what will happen with the Doha round. And once again, the United States will play a very important role in this, which will be the leadership played by the new USDR, and how will this facilitate or not the closing of the new Doha round. And of course, the expectations referring to the summit that will be held in Trinidad Tobago in the coming days, which is a new coming together, and we are all interested in seeing what will happen here. These are the main comments that I can summarize from the panels I was present at. Thank you, Minister Plata.
To give us your questions and comments about the meeting, or about reactions to what you have heard, or your suggestions about things that you have not heard and that ought to be part of any conclusion. Yes, just simplemente díganos, por favor,
Please give us your name and your affiliation. Carlos Tramotola from Argentina, and I would like to ask the governor from Minas Gerais, which were the main obstacles found in making the state reform and enabling the state to become more effective? Was it the civil servants, the government, the laws? Once again, this is the question I posed to the governor of Minas Gerais. I thank you for your question, from our neighbor in Argentina, and I would like to respond to it. In truth, my experience dates back to before before I took office 7 years ago in Minas Gerais. I was a leader at the House of Representatives during Fernando Henrique Cardoso's mandate, and the parliamentary experience is always very important when you are making decisions. I always state that there should be an article in the Constitution forcing any of the candidates to the executive branch to go through the legislative branch at any level, because this will lead to a greater comprehension of which are the limits to our actions and authority. We learn how to share authority. But the reforms in any field, and my experience points to this, are possible if you comply with three assumptions. The first is the period itself, the time. The great reforms are always made at the beginning of a mandate when the political capital of a candidate is very high. The second important assumption is that there has to be a great political willingness to face resistance to these reforms that are being set forth at any level. And the third assumption is to seek the support of public opinion for these reforms. In Minas Gerais, I believe we carried out the deepest state reform ever carried out in the country. We did away with all of the liabilities in our payroll. And because of the many years of service, we had an enormous salary growth at the end of the year. And although we faced the great resistance of unions and opposition, we were able to transform this growth of salaries into results. At the beginning of every year in Minas Gerais, we set forth clear goals that have to be complied with. For example, to reduce child mortality, and we also have other indicators for education. And this is the most important investment that we are making in the different regions. And all of the public officials involved in those actions will have additional remuneration if they comply with the goals. This is as if we were sharing profit among those who enable us to improve the state activity. That is why I refer to the modernization and the reform of the Brazilian state as being something fundamental to be able to face the crisis and to render better services to the population at large. Another example that clearly shows what has been happening, and once again I refer to Brazil, and to perhaps this is happening in other countries as well. During the last 6 years, the cost of the public apparatus in Brazil increased 70%, while the GDP had an increase of only 26%. And I am even more radical when it comes to this issue. There should be a legal impediment allowing the public spending to go beyond the GDP of each country. Therefore, new standards and permanent evaluation tools of our state and the financial and administrative area should only be occupied by people who will be qualified not by the state but by the Federal University, who is a partner in this process. What I mean by this is that we are attempting to build a new and sound bureaucracy that is not based on sponsorships but based on merit. Once again, we have other states that are following the same direction. In Brazil, we see partnerships among several states, something that never happened before. Minas Gerais and the state of the Amazon have signed an agreement for the products that are produced in the free trade area of Manaus with a competitive advantage. This will enable us to overcome the crisis. But this does not represent only goodwill. What we see is that we have concrete actions that are beginning to take place. Very concretely, the power company of Minas Gerais has signed an agreement with an Argentine company and the state of Ceará to produce wind energy, representing $400 million. Therefore, new sources of energy are being produced through this private and public partnership. But this will only be possible if our states become more streamlined, if we have greater technology, if we are more competitive, and if we are able to attain new markets. Unfortunately, in Brazil, we have been very slow, and this will be deepened due to the difficulties that we are facing. We hope that this process can be accelerated at present. Thank you. Question from the floor.
Ms. Jose Marin from Mexico. And what I wanted to ask the panel is, understanding that each one of the markets in Latin America in the energy sector has very different market structures, what do you think that the end game should be in each one of the markets? And what do you see as the government policy intervention in each one of the cases? I mean, what is your vision in terms of where the Latin America's countries should be in terms of energy market structure? And what do you think that in the end game should be the role that the government should play in that structure?
Thank you. That's obviously, Marcelo, that's your theme.
The question, a questão de
The energy issue, first you have to separate the fuel market and the electric power market. This is the first mistake when you confuse the two, because their dynamics are totally different. The fuel market and the oil market are markets which you can try to establish a general policy for and some other type of logic or rationale. As far as energy generation market goes, it's no use trying to... Well, the regulatory question depends on each market. Each market will have its own matrix, depending on where it is. In Latin America, there are 3 totally different regions. Central America, for example, does not have a capacity of electric power generation capacity. They have to import oil, or else build some huge plants. If you take the rest of South America, there's a huge generation capacity. Hydroelectricity, sugarcane bagasse in the northeast. We have wind energy, wind power. So this question varies. What has to be done is to observe each country in its capacity to find out which is the best matrix from the point of view economics and environmentally. But each country should be taken in turn.
Hello. If you allow me, I will ask my question in Spanish. My name is...
In the conclusions, as one of the advantages of the region, it was pointed out that we have a political stability. And if you allow me to express my personal opinion from Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Bolivia, this is not the case. I have attempted to take part in most of the panels, and I see that the issue of the challenges of the democracies was approached in a very timid fashion. I do not know if this is a policy of the forum or if there exists a consensus that the challenges of democracy are not relevant and that they could not infect or the rest of the region. A small country like Nicaragua that was doing well in terms of human rights has now had serious backwardness in terms of this. So perhaps I could have a response to this question from the Minister of Colombia. Well, thank you, Moises. This is a very complex question, and I will have to be very prudent in my answer. It is very difficult to give an opinion on this issue because as part of a government, I have to be very respectful of what is happening in other countries. We always respect the autonomy of each different country, and countries are free to choose their own governors, and they do this within a democratic process. Therefore, it is very difficult to issue an opinion on this, and it is at fora such as this one where we can freely express our opinions. and hear the opinions of others regarding this issue. As I am the representative of a government, once again, whatever I say will represent my personal opinion and not the opinion of my government. Therefore, Felix, I would like to be very prudent. Perhaps this issue should have been debated further at this forum. As a country, once again, we respect the autonomy and the decisions made by other countries. I do not have the limitations of the minister, and I can say that one of the divisions that we see clearly in Latin America no longer refers to rightist parties or leftist parties. It refers to democracies. We see that the countries are going in opposite directions, and I believe that we will continue seeing this in the future. Professor Markovic would like to express his opinion.
Unicamente para Jacques Markovic, I'm a professor at the University of Sao Paulo, advisor to the forum, and with the Latin American team, the responsibility to help in the design of the program. First of all, media and democracy addressed exactly the issue that you brought up. I think that we have a serious challenge in the region, and it is to protect what was already conquered in terms of democracy, first. Second, is to look at the most vulnerable countries that we have, and this is the reason why in the final declaration there is a special topic requesting attention to the 34 presidents that will meet in Trinidad and Tobago, not with the countries that have the resources for counter-cyclical policies. This is Mexico, it is Argentina, this is mainly Chile and Brazil, but for the smallest countries, the most vulnerable, that they don't have the resources for such counter-cyclical policies. And this is why, beside the attention in terms of economic, social, and environmental issues, there is a special concern for political topics. Obviously, you are right. When we are facing a crisis, and the fact that this program looked at, on one side, how to face up the crisis, and on the other side, as many of our panelists here now, they are looking at the fundamentals of new development cycle. The democracy and politics are the means to turn those dreams in results. So I want to thank you for bringing up this issue, but it was in the program, and it is also in the final declaration.
Thank you, Jacques.
Hello, I'm Beatriz Nofal from Argentina. It's just a suggestion to be incorporated in the final declaration. It's an issue we brought up in a previous meeting.
Bring the microphone close to you.
Yes, given the fact that we are in the midst of a global financial crisis, and like one of the panelists, Marcelo, said, in the region is expressing as a great crisis, given the fact that the last question asked for this panel was how to increase new investments to create a safer, cleaner, and more inclusive economy. One of the conclusions is that we should try to create at the regional level and at the global level. At the regional level, then Trinidad and Tobago is important, and at the global level, the G20 is important. A global facility to be able to finance investments, because in the region we are witnessing a suspension of investment projects in food production and in clean energies, in climatic change, because of lack of finance. So this is an issue that is of utmost importance, and we could add entrepreneurship, because what is important for smaller economies is not only large-scale investment, but to developing local entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Beatriz. Ricardo, you have been quite precise in saying, and I think we all share, that this crisis requires the unblocking of the financial system and the strengthening of the financial system. There is no doubt that a recovery will not happen if the financial system does not recover. And we know what is the list of things that are needed, stronger capital requirements and more capital in the banks, better regulation, better risk-taking and all that. That is part of the conversation. But how do we go from where we are now to achieving all of the list of things that we need, that we know we need to have a financial system that begins to work again in the way it should?
Well, Moises, I think it's a quite interesting question since we're visiting and trying to understand this global crisis. We need a global perspective, but also a local perspective. Because for this first time, we're not the cause of the crisis. We're importing the crisis from abroad, and for the first time, we might have some of the solutions in here, in Brazil, in Chile, in other countries, in Latin America. But to address your question, and it will be non-exhaustive, what I have to say, if you look to the micro level, corporate level, some of the financial institutions can do a couple things to become more healthy. And one you mentioned is take a good look at capital adequacy. And I'll give an example of the bank I work for. It's Itaú Unibanco. Here in Brazil, we have a minimum requirement of capital of 11%, which is above the 8% required by Basel. So it's already more conservative posture that our regulation requires. Not only the bank puts a buffer, 25% on the top of this 11, but it's currently with another buffer, 16.5, which is double what's required by Basel. So capital adequacy cannot be in the minimum limit. The other thing, I think it's time to strengthen balance sheets and look for deposits and look for more clients and go back to basics. Cannot be arrogant and try to do some complex leverage transactions. So balance sheet needs to be strong to go through in a healthy way through these turbulent times. The other thing I would mention, I think, will be controls and more focus in risk management, for example. It was quite neglected. Some PhDs, rocket science were doing things, but the board members, for example, were not understanding what was going on. So that brings another point, I think, of review in governance in the financial sector. And board members need to be more risk aware and more risk savvy in order to understand the complexity of the products and the structure of services then being provided to clients. And another point on the corporate level, I think it's a good moment to review the compensation systems of leaders, of managers, of bankers, and in a manner that's aligned to shareholders. It's a topic of ownership that Marcelo brought up yesterday at the panel, but more focus also on the long term, not only the short term. You make your quarterly targets and you receive a bonus and you go or you're promoted. But also adjusted to risk, because it's very easy to have a return. You just open the wheel of credit, you have revenues, but you also have some risk associated, you have some capital involved. And also the basic one, I think, the corporate university of this financial institution teach ethics. It's not enough to teach ethics. Would be a core discipline, I think, in all institutions. On the sectorial side, I'll mention a couple things that will be useful as well. One, I think, is to exchange best practices, not only intra-sector, but inter-regional. The different banking associations in Latin America, for example, could exchange best practices in terms of government, risk management, controls, and even regulation. That brings to another point. I think it's key to talk about nowadays, revisit the regulatory framework, being careful not to over-regulate the sector. Otherwise, we'll become just a utility company with a lot of regulation, and it will be very drastic for the credit expansion. And the other thing, I think, will be intelligent supervision, things that was lacking, at least in the United States, and G20 is trying to do so as they gather to review the supervision effort. And last but not least, I will mention that should work together in cooperation with the multilaterals in order to revive credit. It's very important to keep credit flowing and companies having the working capital. And also to the end of the day, so we can achieve confidence, which is the most important ingredient nowadays for markets, to clients, to everyone.
Thank you very much. Marcelo, I want to give you a very brief opportunity, short, to go back to your point, a very good point about ownership. You have said that this crisis is not necessarily a crisis of confidence or credit, or there's a crisis of ownership. What do you mean by that?
Just making sure I speak in the two languages. Lack of ownership em inglês, falta de dono em português. Aí tem dois aspectos.
2 points. Well, if it belongs to everyone, it belongs to no one. And the second aspect is that you need a commitment, a long-term commitment of the company. When you have everybody tied to short-term bonuses, or an investor whose share drops 2% and he goes to another company, well, you know, he's not that's an investor. So we have to have an owner, and the one who is the ones who are going to look for investors are the owners. So lack of ownership is lack of this kind of thing.
My question is, given the fact that some of the countries that have the most irresponsible fiscal policies in the continent have banded together to create a new currency called the sucre to do international trade. What would that bring to effect to multilateral trade and trade financing in the Americas?
This is probably, again, for you, Minister Plata, and for any of you.
Well, coming up with a currency, it's a very complex problem, and doing trade, doing exchanges in domestic currencies is very difficult. That's why we all use a common denominator, which is the dollar. But most recently, there's been a lot of talk about this, about using local currency. Actually, we were in Venezuela just the day before yesterday, and President Chavez mentioned the possibility of trading using bolívares and pesos as the trade currency. And we're exploring this, but this is very much in its infancy. And the reason that countries migrate to a common denominator is because there are trade imbalances. And so when there's trade imbalances, which is natural in trade, you have a trade imbalance with one country, but you compensate and you have a surplus with a different country. When this happens, you need to have this currency as a common denominator. When you don't have that, it's very difficult, because otherwise you'll be flooded with different currencies that you cannot exchange in the market. It makes things very difficult. So I think it's an idea that's very much still in its infancy, that we trade in our own currencies. Now the idea of moving to another currency, like Europe did in the case of the euro, which they created a whole new currency and made it a common currency, is another possibility. But I think that's still pretty much a far-fetched idea. It requires a large degree of integration. It requires for countries to lose control over monetary policy, and I don't think we are at that point right now. So it's an idea. You have to study them. You have to look at things, but it's not that simple.
Yeah, it's simple to ask you. How many of you would like to save your savings in sucres?
I should have said that, and then I wouldn't have to explain anything else.
We are running out of time, and I just want to highlight some of the surprises. Perhaps the most important surprise I think, has been mentioned here. Those of us that were in Davos just 3 months ago came out of that meeting feeling that it was the most pessimistic atmosphere that we had encountered in many, many years, in many, many meetings. Who would have said that after 3 months in this meeting, it is not that we are completely optimistic, but certainly the mood has changed. And I think it's very interesting how the mood in these conversations is that, yes, the problem is here, the problem is big, the problem is going to be with us for a while, but we are no longer in a free fall, we are no longer in this calamitous mood that I think we all perceived in Davos. So that's the first surprise, how quickly things can change. The other surprise is not only how quickly the situation can change, but how quickly also countries can change. And I want to use that reference to the case of Colombia. Colombia 10, 15 years ago was was untouchable for investors. The security problems, drugs, the instability was making investors very wary of considering Colombia. Today, Colombia is one of the prime locations for foreign investors in Latin America, together with Brazil and many other countries. But this is, again, to show how quickly things change. And in fact, that also gives me an opportunity to give Minister Plata the opportunity to invite us to the next Latin America's World Economic Forums meeting in Latin America, which is going to be in Colombia, something that would have not been possible without the immense progress that Colombia has experienced in the last few years. Minister Plata.
Moises, thank you so much for your kind words, and I'll speak in English for this bit. Let me ask, I just want to make a very brief survey. Just going to ask two questions for the audience. Who has been to Colombia in the audience? Okay, that's a good number, thank you. And let me ask a second question, which is the most difficult question. Who has been told not to go to Colombia? Okay, that's a fair number, but be honest, there's probably more of you that at some point were warned by a wife or husband or family or friends that you probably shouldn't go to Colombia. And I say this because really, as Moises pointed out, Colombia has made a tremendous turnaround. In just 5-6 years, the country has changed dramatically, and I will not go into the details because I think President Uribe was able to transmit that yesterday, and he does it much better than I do, on what's happened in the country, so I'm not going to repeat myself. But as the country changes, as Colombia has made tremendous progress, we still have one major issue, and that's the image problem. Because the fact is that reality changes, but it takes longer for image, for perception to change than for reality. And I think that's true for a country, that's true for a person, that's true for a company. Many times there's big changes, there's a change in the management and production, quality of the product goes much, much better, but the customer still perceives something different. And it's the same case with a country. We've made the turnaround, but still we have what we call the perception gap. And that means that reality has gone up, has increased, but perception is lagging behind. So probably what you will find in Colombia is that there's a huge gap between perception and reality, and that you will see a country which is much more different than one would imagine. It's a country that's vibrant, it's a country that's growing, it's a country that has challenges. I'm not saying that everything has been resolved. We have difficulties, many challenges, but we're facing them. Regarding the World Economic Forum in Cartagena, I'm very proud to announce that we'll be the host next year. We'll hope to see you all there. We have great hospitality in Colombia, we're well known for that. But it will be hosted also in the historical city of Cartagena, which used to be the main Spanish fortress back in the 1700s, where most of the gold was shipped to Europe. So it's a fortified city, beautiful castles, beautiful walls, great restaurants, great nightlife. Of course, we're all going there to work, so nobody really cares about the nightlife or the entertainment. I know that, but if you have a chance, you may want to check it out. So really, thank you so much. Thank you, Moises, and thank you all. Thank you, Professor Schwab, for giving Colombia this important opportunity, and we'll be very, very happy to see you there in April 2010. Thank you.
And thank you, Minister Plata. And Colombia will have to make a huge effort to exceed the warmth, hospitality, generosity of our host country, Brazil. Colombia is not the only country that has experienced a profound transformation. We are all in awe and admire the changes in Brazil. Today, Brazil is not only a regional power, is also an indispensable interlocutor to deal with any of the problems that the world faces, from climate change to trade to the financial crisis or innovations in regional governments, in federal management, in the banking, in infrastructure. We all look to Brazil to set as a model and as an example of a country that is showing the way for the rest of the region. So, and today we had in our panel some wonderful examples of the new leadership that is transforming Brazil, and it is also a model for all of us. Ricardo, Villela, Marino, Governor Aécio, Neves, Cunha, Marcelo, Bahia, Odebrecht. Thank you very much for your hospitality. Thank you very much for all you did. And Luis Guillermo Plata, also thank you for being a part of this interesting panel. This has been another extraordinary meeting of the World Economic Forum, and we all know that extraordinary meetings do not happen without extraordinary teams behind them. This has been an impeccable meeting in terms of the logistics, in terms of the intellectual content, in terms of the guests, the speakers, and so on. That doesn't happen without a very world-class team, and I want to take this opportunity to recognize, there are too many, it's a cast of thousands, but I want to recognize the intellectual leadership and the effectiveness of Emilio Lozoya, and I don't know where is Emilio, if it's here, but I want to recognize him, Emilio. And please, a round of applause for Emilio Lozoya. Who works hand in hand under the wise and sage guidance of Professor Jacques Markovich. Please, a round of applause for Mr. Markovich. And with this, I conclude my role. I want to thank the panel again for a wonderful set of ideas and conclusions. And I will give the floor then to Mr. Robert Greenhill, the Managing Director and Chief Business Manager of the World Economic Forum.
Thank you very much, Moises. And thank you, everybody. This is the end of 2 extraordinary days. And one less an extraordinary microphone.
Here.
No, I think I can speak like this. I'd just like to make 2 or 3 points. First of all, to thank all of you, because this is actually, in a time of crisis, a record turnout. This is almost 20% higher than in other years. And it's proof that in a time of crisis, people either come together or come apart. And the Latin America Summit was a real coming together of the Latin American and the global community. And I think that was reflected in the quality of the conversations that we had.
See here.
The other element I'd like to do is to thank the co-chairs with their really impressive intellectual contribution. Ricardo, Marino, Marcelo, Odebrecht. We had Timothy Flynn, Jim Goodnight, Lord Levine. And together with our partners, Apex Brazil, the city and the government of Rio de Janeiro, President Lula and his team, and the people of Brazil, the tremendous security staff, the students, the people who were very engaged, together with Emilio on the Latin American team and the staff of the forum. I think it really brought together quite an extraordinary meeting. And you know, in terms of what we can take away from this, I think clearly the complexity of the challenges today are quite awesome, not just the financial and economic challenges, but dealing with sustainable development in every sense, having sustainable corporations with real long-term leadership, having a sustainable energy approach, dealing with food security, dealing with climate change. But what is, I think, really, in a sense, reassuring coming out of this is there are solutions. And Latin America in every one of these elements, from financial, contributing to the IMF, to economic, with provisions in 2010 returns to growth, to on energy security, creative approaches to biofuels, new ways of dealing with social programs such as Bolsa Familia. Latin America is now a source of solutions. And I think it was clear to me personally, the reason behind that is there's a whole generation of committed creative leadership in both the private and the public sectors that we're seeing, in fact, in this panel today and over the last couple of days that have decided to substitute ideology with practicality to determine what works in an economic sense, in a social sense, in a political sense, and then to apply it. And where there's been, I think, very creative and positive competition in the private space between corporations as to how to get better, and also in the public space, where governors of states are learning from one another, national leaders are sharing ideas and competing to see who can actually best apply these new ideas. And that kind of collaborative competition in the public and private spaces by this generation of political leadership is I think, one of the great signs coming out of Latin America that help explain why Latin America today is in such a different state than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So I think I personally leave this session of the forum with a strengthened understanding and with a reconfirmed appreciation of the contribution Latin America is making. And these ideas are also going to be contributing to the thinking of the forum over the next year. We have a series of regional events. We'll be this September in Dalian in China having an extraordinary annual meeting with some of our global growth companies, some of our most thoughtful leaders, our young global leaders, 3 of whom are represented in this panel here today, to actually look at what are practical ways to come together to move the world forward in a positive sense out of the global crisis right now. And that will then provide input into Davos in January of 2010. And then, of course, I look forward to seeing all of you in Cartagena, Colombia, to continue the cycle of conversation at even a higher level. So thank you once again. Thank you for participating, and we wish you all a good return home.